Okay, because it's a very short time for this webinar, just 1 hour, and there is quite a lot to cover. So we will quickly start now. I am Pankaj Bhatia, Global Director of Greenhouse Gas Protocol at the World Resources Institute. On behalf of WRI and WBCSD, our co-convening partner, and the team that is assembled here, the GHG Protocol team, we extend a very warm welcome to you all who have joined this webinar. This is our third webinar in the series that we started a few months back after completing the survey process. In this webinar, we will talk about preliminary findings from the market-based accounting survey that will help inform the scope of potential updates considered via our stakeholder consultation process. Here is a quick overview of the agenda for today. After I complete the introduction, I will hand it over to Michael McRae, my colleague here and Senior Manager of Scope 2 Work Program. He will start us off with background and context on the work ahead of us, followed by high-level observations emerging from stakeholder feedback. Then Kevin Kirkle, who is leading the market-based accounting survey work here, will cover the rest of the presentation, focusing on what we have learned so far from the survey responses and proposals. Then Michael and I will wrap it up at the end, sharing next steps for engagement, and if time permits, we can share responses to questions submitted from audience members. Next slide, please. Consistent with our previous standards development work, we formally initiated this process with a global stakeholder survey to collect feedback to understand user needs, identify topics which may warrant revision, and solicit proposals on specific updates. Between November 2022 and March 2023, we collected around 1,500 survey submissions and 230 proposals. Actually, I should correct myself. So as it's noted, this is the fourth and final webinar, or it could be the third actually, and this is to be corrected. I think maybe later Michael might. I think we did one on Scope 2, one on corporate standard, and Scope 3 together, second. And this is the third and final webinar to conclude our top-line findings from the surveys we conducted and concluded in March this year. The 4 surveys we covered were on the corporate standards, Scope 2 guidance, Scope 3 standards and calculation guidance, and this survey on market-based approaches. Stakeholders also had an opportunity to submit proposals. Many of you provided responses, excellent responses. Thanks to you all. We truly appreciate the detailed responses we received. There's a lot of guidance and a lot of very, very good ideas that we are still going through and to further, I think, leverage during our stakeholder process, particularly the technical working group process. Now, if you missed our previous webinars, you can watch the webinar recordings and access the slides for the presentations at ghgprotocol.org website, as well as download a comprehensive Scope 2 summary that was published in July. We are currently working to complete the remaining detailed summary reports before the end of the year. Today's webinar is also being recorded, and both the recording and slides will be shared afterwards. Please also remember to subscribe to our newsletter if you haven't already done it. Next slide, please. Now, we are currently, I think, in this phase of developing work plans and forming governing bodies. This is a very important phase. Actually, it is the foundational phase of the whole work. Based on the survey feedback and proposals and our analysis, we are drafting work plans corresponding to the various work streams. Simultaneously, we are also finalizing plans for a revamped governance structure that will include new governing bodies to provide overall strategic direction and oversight of the standards update process. Many of you must be familiar with the GHG Protocol's global multi-stakeholder process. In the last 20 plus years, we have successfully produced a number of standards based on a multi-stakeholder process. Generally speaking, we will carry forward the same principles and objectives that were embodied in our current multi-stakeholder process, also in the new setup. In the new setup, the intention is that there will be some permanent bodies, ongoing bodies. So the stakeholder process will continue at least in some form and shape. There will be a permanent steering committee, an independent standards board that will oversee the development and the formulation of the standards, the approval of the standards. There will be technical working groups, generally aligned with the various work streams like the corporate standards, scope 2, scope 3, and market-based approach, that will carry the main task of drafting the text of the standards. The GHG Protocol Secretariat will work very closely with all three of these groups to support them and make sure these new governing systems are rigorous, effective, and can make decisions in a much timelier manner. We are aiming to share more details on how these governing bodies will be structured and will operate in the coming weeks. This will include the terms of reference, the structure and balance of representation, and also the application process to join the various governing bodies. We are expecting that there will be a public call for nominations to the steering committee and independent standards board in a few weeks' time. We also anticipate to launch the technical working group process in early 2024. And with this new governance systems in place, we expect to complete the updates in 2 years with drafts for public review between 24 and 25 and final standards in 2025. Next slide, please. Now, I just wanted to share my perspective and reflection on the overall messages that I see are emerging, particularly from the market-based approach feedback that we are going to learn today, but also bringing some of the messages from other areas. I think, first of all, there is a significant interest across the surveys for enabling methods to account for and recognize the impact of mitigation actions. Clearly, I think there has been a concern that there has been some gap in enabling companies to account for mitigation impacts within the scopes and outside the scopes. Currently, most of the disclosure and target setting programs, they focus on inventory accounting that is within the scopes, but there is a role in place also for the accounting of mitigation impacts. Then also respondents have requested that GHG Protocol provide clarity on accounting methods applicable to both impacts within and outside the scopes, as well as reporting of use and claims associated with project impacts, market-based instruments, etc. Now, I should mention also quickly here that market-based is an interim term, I think, and is likely to change to a more accurate descriptor of the type of accounting and scope that will be addressed under this work stream. As I said, we have two systems, inventory accounting and intervention accounting, one might say, and both are very important, valuable systems, and both actually provide tools for business to make effective plans and achieve progress towards their goals. So definitely we need to recognize that both systems have roles for companies in achieving targets and driving ambition. Now, I think in the context of the market-based work stream, we will likely see work and guidance on addressing the second type of accounting that I mentioned, which could be intervention accounting or performance accounting. Clearly, I think as that gap is addressed, we are also seeing that even on the inventory side, the full accounting has to also be enabled. For example, I just will give one example, and I think we will cover some of the details. I think, for example, there are mitigation impacts that can occur through investments. Companies can make investments, and that can result in mitigation impacts inside or outside the inventory. But then there are a large body of investments that companies make that are supposed to be accounted for in the scope 3 category 15. And so one of the concerns also we have heard is to ensure that we avoid such possibilities of cherry picking, where a certain type of mitigation impacts could be enabled, they could be identified, and they could be also included, but then a large body of investments that may remain unnoticed, that should also be addressed properly. And so this is just to give you an example that this is quite a complex accounting that we are facing here in addressing issues related to market-based instruments. And this is just a beginning of a journey. And I think you will all have an opportunity to participate in this journey of helping us to make sure that we get the guidance right, correct, complete, either through the technical working groups, or also there will be an opportunity through the review groups and other types of review feedback opportunities that we will provide during the course of the development of the guidance. So I know this may not be complete, but let me end my introductory remarks here and hand it over to my colleague Michael, who will walk us through some of the overall background to the GHG protocol and some reflections, and then Kevin will walk us through some of the details of the feedback we have heard from the stakeholders. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you, Pankaj, so much. Good morning, good afternoon to everybody joining us from around the world. We have over 1,000 of us now on the webinar, and we're really excited to share these updates today. Let's continue starting with a brief recap. Oh, sorry, next slide, please. Starting with a brief recap of what the GHG protocol is, its history, and an overview of the tools and resources it provides organizations. First, the GHG protocol is a co-convened initiative hosted by the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, WBCSD, and the World Resources Institute, WRI. The protocol's standards and guidance are the world's most widely used GHG accounting and reporting standards for organizations to measure, manage, and report their emissions, as well as track progress towards their GHG emission targets. In terms of its adoption, the protocol has become so ubiquitous that it now serves as the foundation of most greenhouse gas accounting guidance programs and target setting initiatives. It is also used by climate rating agencies and investor reporting, as well as in carbon markets and increasingly in international policies and regulations. As Pankaj alluded to, this success is in no small part an outcome of how the GHG protocol has and will continue to develop its standards, namely through a comprehensive multi-stakeholder process inclusive of businesses, governments, academia, NGOs, civil society, and others. Next slide, please. To help give us context on this revision process, we'll start with a little bit of history. Following the Kyoto Protocol in 1997, WRI and WBCSD formed a partnership to develop the current corporate standard published in 2004 and the Project Protocol published in 2005. In the last 2 decades since the introduction of these standards, numerous additional standards have been published as shown across this timeline. There have also been significant transformations in the market, such as a massive increase in GHG inventory reporting, development of a growing number of mandatory climate disclosure regulations alongside the voluntary adoption of net zero targets. And throughout all of this, we can continue to benefit and learn from academic research on the outcomes of the standards use by thousands of organizations. To ensure the GHG protocol continues to effectively support and enable these developments, a process was started last year to understand what updates may benefit the corporate standard, the Scope 2 guidance, and the Scope 3 standard. The overall objectives of this revision process include outcomes that both enable appropriate harmonization and alignment with major disclosure initiatives, and to ensure that GHG protocol standards are effective in providing a rigorous and credible accounting foundation for organizations to plan, track, and report progress towards science-based net zero targets in line with the global 1.5 degrees Celsius target. Next slide, please. Let's spend just a moment on the basics of how the corporate standard does this with inventory accounting. Inventory accounting involves measuring and reporting GHG emissions and removals that occur across an organization's entire operations within a specific reporting period. It provides a comprehensive assessment of all the emission sources and sinks within the organization's boundaries, encompassing both direct emissions, Scope 1, and indirect emissions, Scope 2 and 3. Next slide, please. In addition to inventory accounting, the GHG Protocol also provides standards for project accounting. Project accounting, also called intervention or impact accounting, focuses on measuring and reporting GHG emissions associated with specific activities, initiatives, or projects. It entails quantifying the emission reductions or removals or increases relative to a baseline that are directly attributable to these individual projects, often for the purpose of assessing their climate impact and evaluating their effectiveness in reducing total global emissions. Project accounting can provide a more granular view of all the emissions related to particular actions or interventions. Bringing these two methods, inventory and project accounting, bringing them together forms the basis for what the GHG Protocol standards have defined as a complete GHG emission report. Next slide, please. To help illustrate what this means, we can start with the core requirement shown here as the smallest nested circle in the upper center, reporting an inventory of emissions consistent with the GHG Protocol corporate standard, Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3. Moving outward, the standard states a complete GHG emission report should also include information on project-based GHG reductions calculated using the protocol standard for project accounting, with, importantly, this information reported separately from Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3 emissions. As we continue to expand beyond what's covered by the GHG Protocol standards into the full ecosystem of climate disclosures, sustainability reports, goal and target setting programs, etc., these can and often do include a broad array of additional relevant information. We'll use this framework today to help organize where and how various solutions can most appropriately align with these methods and reporting categories. Next slide, please. Before we turn to Kevin, let's pause for an observation across all the survey feedback. As we just covered, the GHG Protocol provides standards for two separate but valuable accounting methods: inventory accounting and project or intervention accounting. Again, inventory accounting provides a view of an organization's entire greenhouse gas emission profile, covering Scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. On the other hand, to capture specific emission reductions achieved by projects, the GHG Protocol provides the project accounting standard. Again, this method helps quantify total changes in emissions, be they reductions, removals, or increases attributed to specific actions. Stakeholder feedback has highlighted that both concepts are viewed as essential for companies in driving ambition and achieving meaningful decarbonization targets. However, with these notably different accounting purposes, the GHG Protocol standards emphasize that these two methods must be reported separately to ensure accurate and comprehensive reporting of both an organization's overall emissions and the specific contribution of individual projects. If we respect these fundamental accounting principles, a key challenge quickly emerges. Metrics for intervention or project accounting are currently largely absent or a low priority within most target and goal setting programs, mandatory disclosures, and other initiatives used by organizations to incentivize and unlock the capital necessary to drive their corporate climate actions. How we work together to resolve these issues will be instrumental in ensuring the GHG Protocol standards continue to effectively provide a rigorous and credible accounting foundation for organizations to plan, track, and report progress towards science-based net zero targets in line with the global 1.5 degrees Celsius target. So with these high-level observations across all the surveys in our mind, let's now turn to a deeper dive of this survey's feedback. Kevin, over to you.
Great. Thank you, Michael. My name is Kevin Kirkle. I've been reviewing the market-based accounting approaches survey and proposal, and I'm happy to share some of our summary here today. As has been mentioned, I do want to emphasize at the start here that this will be a high-level summary. We received an incredible depth of both the quantity and depth of responses, so we're only going to be able, within the bounds of this webinar, to really get into some of the high-level summary there, but want to emphasize that this is the first step in a process towards diving much deeper into this content, as we will discuss in the next steps to highlight some of the opportunities for where that deeper dive will be made available. But for now, just want to highlight that we're going to have to keep this relatively high level, given how much great information we received through the survey. Also, just want to note, as I try to move through a lot of this content relatively quickly to make sure that there's some time for Q&A, that we did receive questions submitted as part of the registration process. So as best we can, we've tried to integrate those questions or the answers to those questions into the content here. So hopefully we are answering some of your questions as we go, if there is a squeeze on that Q&A session. With that, if we move to the next slide. Before we get into the feedback, I want to just very briefly look at some of the responses we got here, some of the background data there on who we heard from. So as was seen in a previous slide, we got about 350 survey responses. They're broken out here by organization type, region, and sector. I won't go through every point of this, but to perhaps highlight 2 points. One on the organization type, that we see the largest category of respondent being companies, industry groups, and consultants. And then also regionally, we see a very heavy concentration into Europe and North America. So something important to carry forward as we think about making sure that the standard is globally applicable. Moving into the next slide. So the outline of the summary to follow, we will be looking at 7 feedback topics. The first 2 in great detail, and then the next 5 in a bit of a quicker fashion. So those topics being first, the accounting approach, then instrument reporting, the sectoral approach, accounting objectives, the role of the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, partnerships and alignment, and proposal submissions. A note on the structure of the presentation here is that you will see in the title of each slide either feedback or background. Feedback slide are those that are a reflection of the ideas submitted through the survey and proposals. These are not to be interpreted as an endorsement or indicative of the path forward necessarily for the protocol, but are meant to be just that, a reflection of the ideas submitted. Whereas background slides are those with information from the survey memo and from GHG protocol standards that are used to contextualize the feedback. Next slide. One bit of background here as well that Pankaj and Michael have touched on a bit already is we want to be clear that within the context of the survey and the webinar, the term market-based accounting was used to broadly refer to 2 different accounting methodologies. Mechanisms designed to enable contractual traceability in a supply chain with limited physical traceability, most often for use in inventory accounting, as well as mechanisms designed to measure and establish the relationship of the emission reductions or removals associated with a project or intervention, including ownership, most often associated with project accounting. As was mentioned, the categorizations and definitions related to market-based accounting within this webinar are used to provide some preliminary framework by which to solicit and understand the feedback provided through the survey and proposals. This is something, as we will see in some of the feedback that is to follow, there was some disagreements about the way that the terminology was used, and I think it is clear that moving forward, part of the process will be to work with stakeholders and partners to better establish a commonly understood terminology to make sure that the conversations in this space are as productive and well understood as possible. Next slide. So getting into the first bit of feedback here, we have some uncertainty on the relationship between inventory and project accounting. So as Michael was speaking to, currently the Greenhouse Gas Protocol standards are based on a separation between inventory accounting and project intervention accounting. Survey responses express multiple perspectives on the role of project or intervention accounting methods relative to Greenhouse Gas Protocol inventory accounting. Of those responses, the majority of respondents were unsure whether the two approaches could be integrated. Some of that uncertainty stemmed from uncertainty on technically how those could be integrated, others from perhaps confusion on the structure or the nature of the question, but it did seem notable that the majority of the responses there were unsure on this side. For respondents that suggested that the approaches should be integrated, often those responses cited an existing integration in practice or in other programs, as well as a need for the demonstration of impact. So impact being something most often associated with project or intervention accounting. And for many respondents, that was a priority of being able to integrate that demonstration of impact into an inventory space. For respondents that suggested that the approaches should not be integrated, what was often cited was inconsistent objectives between the two methods. So often suggesting that the two approaches are intended to answer different questions and that through integration, it might in fact muddy the answers to sort of both sets of questions there, as well as citing variability introduced via the selection of a counterfactual scenario. As we often see in the case of project or intervention accounting, some respondents were worried about that sort of variability that comes with the assumptions and the selection process. Next slide. Next, we have some feedback on inventory and emissions report structures. So in the survey proposals, respondents suggested different inventory and emissions report structures to accommodate or separate market-based or project-based accounting instruments. These are presented here in no order, but just to run through. Some respondents suggested that dual reporting should appear in all scopes. So this would be following the principles of scope 2 dual reporting of a location-based method and a market-based method, and echoing that approach out to scopes 1 and scopes 3. Other respondents suggested that either only market-based should be reported in the inventory or only location-based should be reported in the inventory. So these two being the inverse, with a prioritization of one or the other within the inventory, often based off of the objectives of the respondent there. And a note on those approaches is that, as is highlighted here in the case of location-based, but is applicable in inverse to the only market-based case, that market-based, project-based, or other types of instruments would be reported separately in the emissions report. Further, some respondents suggested the introduction of an impact or performance-based method in addition to the inventory, so in addition to or alongside scope 1, 2, or 3. And additionally, some rather than putting the spotlight on reporting structures and categories, that instead the protocol should focus on accounting principles and allow other programs or other actors within the accounting ecosystem to determine the treatment of specific methodologies. Next slide. So we're moving now a bit into the second section here around instruments, the treatment of instruments. In the interest of time, and given the complexity of the response in terms of the intersection of many different types of instruments, as well as different reporting structures and different scopes, we won't have the space within this webinar to get into every permutation of the feedback for and against the different versions of how each instrument might be treated. But we do want to be able to speak to those, to some of those points of feedback at a high level. So first, we want to just provide the structure here of the 5 instruments that were defined and that feedback was solicited within the survey, those being offset credits, inset credits, supply shed value chain interventions, mass balance, and book and claim. So as we move into the next slide, before we get into some of those points of feedback around specific treatment, I want to talk here that some respondents expressed dissatisfaction with the provided categorizations of instruments, noting either a disagreement with the definitions as presented, noting that definitions were confusing or vague, and noting that there was a potential overlap between categories. So for some of the respondents, there was a suggestion that this made it difficult to provide clear feedback, Also, this points as well in the direction, as has been noted, of a need to continue to develop, in conjunction with partners, a more cohesive vocabulary to talk about these topics. Additionally, in requesting feedback about the treatment of specific instruments, some respondents suggested that rather than putting the spotlight on individual instruments, that instead the protocol should focus guidance on generalized criteria. For these respondents, often they cited that new approaches may be created. The list of defined instruments is not intended to be exhaustive. There are other ones that may already be in existence or could be created in the near future. And so for some respondents, there was a suggestion that the protocol should focus on providing the generalized criteria that are necessary for a robust accounting system and allow other bodies within the accounting ecosystem to interpret whether a specific approach or instrument meets those criteria. Next slide, please. So, as mentioned, looking here at the potential for expanded use of market-based accounting within an inventory, much of the specific feedback for individual instruments was applied across instruments or applications. So we've compiled some of those broad points here to walk through. And as we talk about in next steps, there will be opportunities for getting into greater levels of depth here. But some of those high-level points in support of inclusion and exclusion of market instruments. First, on the inclusion side, respondents noted that a lack of reporting options hinders decarbonization investments. So for those respondents, there was a focus on using the incentives and the system to serve the objective of enabling investment in decarbonization, and citing that market-based instruments could be an effective approach towards enabling that outcome. The next there, respondents noted that certificates for environmental attributes parallel chain of custody markets. So for these respondents, there was a suggestion that by aligning the conditions and the accounting for environmental attributes with the purchasing and business decisions being made within these value chains, that it would allow for better integration of environmental decision-making into the business decision-making of these corporations, which would be facilitated by market instruments. Third, we had a suggestion from respondents that co-investment through market-based mechanisms benefits supply sheds. This was often cited in the case of Scope 3 reporting or other situations in which direct control of emission sources or direct control of mitigation options may be outside of the direct control of the reporter, and therefore market instruments were highlighted as a way for co-investment into those mitigation options. And finally here, we had a note from respondents that market-based instrument reporting improves transparency and should be consistent for all scopes. So the suggestion being that by adding additional categories or opportunities for reporting market-based instruments, this would speak to the Greenhouse Gas Protocol principles of transparency and consistency. Now, for respondents that supported excluding market instruments, some of the feedback that we heard there was that greenhouse gas inventory accounting should reflect physical emissions, both direct and from the value chain, and that further, market-based accounting may obscure the actual physical emissions. So for these respondents, there was a suggestion that transparency may actually be hindered via the introduction of reporting categories for market-based accounting. Next, we have the suggestion that reporting any additional categories would be overwhelming for many companies. So a commonly cited point within the feedback was that many companies are, especially for medium to smaller size companies, are already struggling in various ways to meet all of the reporting requirements. It is viewed as a very difficult process to gather all of the necessary data and resources. And there was a suggestion from some that adding in additional reporting requirements, additional categories, or additional methods could be overwhelming. Finally, there was a suggestion from some within some of the feedback that more research may be needed to understand the effectiveness of market-based instruments. Many responses suggested that market-based accounting could be effectively achieved with the introduction of certain safeguards in order to ensure the effectiveness of the system. And for a subset of respondents, there was a suggestion that more research is needed to understand what the nature of those safeguards might need to be in order to ensure that effectiveness. Next slide, please. So looking at another cross-section of this feedback, we want to look at some of the major themes here grouped in 3 categories of response. So survey respondents were asked to assess whether and how each of the 5 identified instruments should be used in relation to a greenhouse gas emissions report. Some of the major themes in that feedback are grouped in 3 categories of response. In scopes, in which a respondent suggests the instrument should be used within a greenhouse gas inventory to calculate scope 1 and/or scope 3 emissions. Reported separately, in which a respondent suggests the instrument should be reported separate from the greenhouse gas inventory, yet within a greenhouse gas emissions report, either to provide transparency or potentially to contribute to a target. Or no role, in which a respondent suggests the instrument should have no role in a greenhouse gas emissions report. So looking at some of the feedback within these cross sections, if we move to the next slide. First, we have high-level feedback in support of including instruments within the inventory, i.e. within scopes. And some of the feedback we heard from respondents here was that this would support the principle of transparency and align with the mechanisms of investment. So a point we explored on the prior slides there. Further, that it can provide strong decarbonization incentives for organizations that otherwise lack the capabilities for implementing interventions. Again, this is looking especially in the case of scope 3, as well as in other situations in which the mitigation options may be decoupled from the direct control of the organization. And finally, there was, from some respondents, there was a suggestion that decoupling physical use of a good from its environmental attributes would enable more effective and efficient voluntary decarbonization. We move to the next slide. Some high-level feedback in support of including instruments separately from the inventory, but within the emissions report. Some respondents suggested that project or intervention accounting is inconsistent with an inventory, and therefore anything following that methodology should be reported separately for transparency. So this is often when we're thinking in the context of offsets and insets. Further, there was a suggestion from respondents that it could be leveraged for target setting initiatives. So the exact reasons for reporting separately would vary based off of the objectives of that reporter, but noting that regardless of where it appears, that it would be important to have that information reported so that it could be leveraged as appropriate in target setting initiatives. And finally here, we have that it should be reported separately when decoupling environmental attributes from the products that a company physically consumes. So whereas some suggested that this was a positive aspect and a reason for including in the inventory, for others, this was a reason to separate from the inventory. And on the next slide, some feedback on establishing no role for instruments in reporting. We heard from respondents that a suggestion that the instruments were not as rigorous or as traceable as is needed for credibility. A suggestion that if project or intervention accounting is required, it should not be included at all. Or a suggestion that there were concerns over the verification and assurance process and the credibility of reductions. So the credibility of what would be reported was big within the responses that we saw within this category. Also, this suggestion of, or a question around what would be the verification and assurance that would be required for the system to be effective, and whether such a verification and assurance process could be feasibly achieved. So if we move to the next slide, take a look at some of the feedback. So some feedback in support of including instruments within the inventory. And some feedback in support of including instruments separately from the inventory. So looking at some of the feedback, we heard from respondents that it should be reported separately when decoupling environmental attributes from the products that a company physically consumes. So whereas some suggested that this was a quick breath here as we move into the next section of here around the sectoral approach. So we received some feedback on recommendations for sectoral specific accounting framework. Responses included both recommendations for adopting sector specific guidance or establishing a foundational framework for all sectors, organizations, etc. to follow. So on the feedback in favor of a sector specific approach, some of the reasons cited were that some sectors may benefit from mechanisms for financing decarbonization elsewhere in their value chain, or that various mechanisms may serve as a bridge solution for certain sectors within defined time-bound criteria and conditions. So essentially, both of these variations of the idea that it may be more applicable to certain sectors and should therefore be prioritized within those sectors, marketplaces, or reporting conditions. Finally, we had the suggestion that it may only be needed where value chain traceability issues exist. So within the idea that if market-based accounting is made more available, to understand that it may only be applicable in certain situations and understanding those situations. So in favor of uniform approach, we heard from some respondents that accounting practices should be universally applicable and that introducing case-by-case variation may cause confusion. Additionally, some respondents suggested that the GHG protocol should prioritize consistency, but that variation could be introduced via sector-specific guidance, either built on top of a uniform approach within the protocol and perhaps through externally developed or a program like the Built on GHG Protocol service in order to combine a modular approach to sector-specific guidance. Next slide. Some feedback on stakeholder perspectives varying on accounting objectives. So evaluating any changes to reporting structures or instrument treatment will require assessing alignment and potential conflicts between accounting objectives. So something that came through within the feedback is that different stakeholders, whether they be reporters or others within the ecosystem, basically any stakeholder that would be interacting with an inventory or other emissions reports, have different motivations, different objectives in what they hope to achieve from interacting with the accounting ecosystem. And so understanding what is the full list of those objectives and understanding which objectives can be reasonably achieved by the greenhouse gas protocol, which might be best achieved by other partners within the accounting ecosystem, as well as, if necessary, understanding trade-offs between objectives as we look at different changes that may be made to the structures is going to be an important part of the conversation moving forward as we move into this stakeholder process. So there's a lot of words on this slide. I won't read through them all, but just to cover some of those objectives at the top level bullets, some of the objectives highlighted within the feedback were enhancing emissions accounting and incentivizing investments, establishing greenhouse gas inventory's purpose as exclusively physical accounting of emissions and removals, and enabling comparability and alignment. So again, to be clear, this is coming from the feedback, and this will certainly be something to explore in more depth as we move forward in the stakeholder process. Next slide. Next, we have some feedback on the potential role of the greenhouse gas protocol relative to other programs. So respondents suggested that the greenhouse gas protocol should provide guidance to reduce confusion amongst accounting practitioners. This was identified as a high priority and was fairly common throughout the responses we got, is that there is a drive for the protocol to be involved in some capacity in reducing confusion and providing guidance within this space. Now, the degree of guidance ranged from simply defining terminology and establishing a clear set of definitions up to comprehensive oversight and endorsement of external reporting, target setting, and/or disclosure programs. So the degree to which the protocol is integrated in this is something as well to be explored moving forward. But I think a clear message to come through this is that there is an appetite for some level of involvement and for some level of guidance to reduce confusion amongst practitioners. Additionally, looking at the role of the protocol, another message to come through loud and clear from the feedback is that there is a desire for alignment of guidance within the greenhouse gas accounting ecosystem, such as with SBTI, as well as with other partners. This was a common priority amongst respondents and something certainly that we will be looking to, where possible, enable that alignment and preventing, as was highlighted by some respondents, trying to prevent wherever possible the necessity of multiple bookkeeping in order to align with the accounting requirements of different programs, systems, regulations, etc. So moving to the next slide. Building on that point, something to come through from the feedback was that success requires partnerships and alignment. So many respondents noted that successfully resolving these issues requires collaborations between the Greenhouse Gas Protocol and other programs, disclosure initiatives, etc. On this point, establishing an accounting ecosystem that allows corporations to construct a robust inventory, recognize the impact of actions, and where possible, deliver incentives for climate positive actions requires coordination with partners such as target setting and disclosure programs, voluntary carbon market initiatives, governments and regulators, programs administrators, assurance providers, and others. So as mentioned, this will be a key part of stakeholder-driven process. So there will be collaboration, of course, but certainly within this space, there is a need for great alignment across the accounting ecosystem to make sure that these objectives, incentives, and practices are being well aligned and well understood. Next slide, please. The final point here, much of the previous slides have been focused on feedback from the survey. There was also, through this process, proposals submitted from stakeholders about how to approach some of these topics. In the interest of time, I will not go through these all. These are just a sample of some of what we've seen. I will note for attendance that these proposals are made available on the Greenhouse Gas Protocol website. You may review those at your own leisure. There's a lot of good information there, and these are certainly something that will be carried forward into the stakeholder process. Next slide, please. And with that, I will pass it back to my colleague, Michael, to talk about next steps and to lead the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. Next slide, please. So as we've already touched on, and to try and make sure we have appropriate time for questions and answer, really just want to hit the high notes here that we are still in the process of developing draft work plans and forming our governance bodies, as Pankaj described at the beginning of the call. And I think what we are all interested in at this point is these next steps of the multi-stakeholder revision, development of these standards, learning from the survey process, and working together to develop solutions. Our current anticipated timeline for that is 2024, the remainder of this year into 2024 and 2025, with finalizing and publishing the updated standards and guidance documents by 2025. We stress this over and over again, but if you're interested in receiving additional updates or information on this process, please subscribe to our newsletter at ghgprotocol.org/subscribe. This is the place to find all of the updates, all of the news, all of the developments in this progress. So again, please subscribe if you're interested in staying up to date on all of these actions. And I think that's everything that we have here for next steps. Again, we've touched on these throughout the entire discussion. So next slide, please. Thank you for joining us today. We definitely have some time. We've got about 10 minutes for Q&A. We do want to provide our contact information for everybody interested in reaching out. Pankaj said at the beginning, all of these slides will be made available on the Greenhouse Gas Protocol website. The recording of this webinar will also be posted on this website. If you are subscribed to that newsletter, you will be getting the email of where the link is to the subscription and to the slides. So please, again, GHG Protocol/subscribe. And with that, let's turn to question and answers. We will start with the questions. Thank you to everybody who submitted so many questions in advance. We've gone through those and tried to select and collect the questions that were most commonly submitted to address those first, and then we'll just work through as many as we can. So Pankaj, do you want to start us off with one of the first questions or questions that we've received?
Right. Thank you, Michael. And thank you, Kevin. Very, very good presentation. I actually have seen the slides, but today as you were presenting, I thought I had even better insights. So excellent presentation. There are so many questions, and unfortunately, we are not able to answer them all. Our apologies for that. Actually, as I go through the list of questions, one general response I would like to make is that there used to be a time in the GHG protocol. I have been associated with GHG protocol now for more than 20 years. And there used to be a time when we were able to respond to technical questions, provide advice, even somewhat consulting support without any formal arrangements. We used to love that role to enable the application of GHG protocol correctly and completely. But with now, I think it has changed quite a lot, and I see so many questions that I generally would have liked to provide advice on to the extent I can, or the team members here, but we are unable to respond now. Even if you, like today now, and if you were to send even an email, we are unable to respond. And now we recommend that there's so many consulting groups with excellent expertise on GHG protocol, that such technical questions like you have here on the application of GHG protocol rules, that you may want to bring on some consulting support if you're facing them quite a lot. Then if Michael, I can just address two other points and then hand it back to you. There was a question on how will GHG protocol rectify and or balance opposing views on different accounting approaches, for example, pro and anti-market instruments, from Ariella. Thank you, Ariella, for that question. So this will go to our governing process, our governing bodies, starting with the technical working groups, where we will generate proposals and analyzing the pros and cons and the suitability, and also how to integrate these approaches or instruments in the GHG protocol system. So it will require some discussions. And we also have a decision-making framework that we will use that consists of a few criteria to guide the formation of the proposals and to also guide the ultimate choices, including understanding the trade-offs involved in those choices that will likely be made, I think, in the technical working group and the independent standards board. So this is my response to your question. And then there was a question about SPTI. Doesn't the SPTI standards build on GHG protocol accounting standards and should as such already be aligned? This is from Sana. And you're right, SPTI standards, they do build on GHG protocol accounting standards, but only to the extent where accounting rules are required as a building block. Now, there are many other choices that the SPTI has to make where GHG protocol does not weigh in, and they do make those choices. Also, you have to remember that GHG protocol is a voluntary standard. We are unable to enforce our standards. We do not enforce our standards. And as programs like SPTI also have an enforcement role. And so they do develop additional rules, monitoring and reporting rules, and also additional policy choices that are layered in on top of the GHG protocol. So I am handing back to you, Michael, but these are the two questions I wanted to address. Thank you.
Wonderful answers, Pankaj. Thank you so much. We have another question that showed up quite a lot in the pre-submitted questions, Pankaj. I'm hoping you touched on this in the beginning, but can you reiterate and clarify? There's a lot of interest in what the mechanism and the process is to apply to be part of our governance or technical bodies. You mentioned the time team at the beginning, but could you just recap what is our current thinking for how that process is anticipated to play out?
Right. So we will, as I said, we will have an open application process for the steering committee and also for the independent standards board. We are currently finalizing an independent recruitment agency that will lead this process. And I'm hoping that in a few weeks' time, that application process will be opened up. We haven't yet completely established the steps towards the formation of technical working groups. We are going to consult with the Independent Standards Board and Steering Committee in getting their guidance. But we do envision that there will be an element of a public call for interest in participating in the technical working groups. And also there will be information shared on what criteria that we would like to follow, what are the expertise areas that we would like to address, and what are some, like Kyla mentioned earlier, diversity criteria that we would like to follow. So it is not yet fully set in place about the technical working groups, but we will come back on that also soon. Thank you.
Wonderful, Pankaj. One of the next questions we got a lot of, and the specific one here was, how will this interact with accounting approaches affecting existing mechanisms in scope 2? This really generalizes to how all of the different work streams will interact, but a lot of interest in, we have this market-based accounting survey, the summary feedback process here. How will all of these different work streams work together? And I think the important message that we can emphasize is that findings that Kevin walked us through today, as well as what Steve and Alexander walked through in the previous webinar, Kyla and myself in the Scope 2 webinar, all of these will be considered holistically across the scopes, and we are in the process of developing detailed draft work plans for consultation with the Independent Standards Board that Pankaj has talked about, as well as with the technical working groups as we get into all of this process next year. So we want to emphasize the holistic nature of this. We are certainly very well aware of how cross-connected and interactive all of these questions are across the corporate standard and all of the other GHG protocol standards and guidance documents. So it's top of our minds as well, and it's something that we're thinking a lot of and looking forward to working with everybody on to make sure that we all collectively do the best possible job that we can. Kevin, there's a question that I'm hoping you can share some information on. We have, what is the current guidance on market-based accounting for RNG, renewable natural gas? For companies that want to procure this, how should they proceed? What is the current standard for biomethane/biomass in scope 1?
Yeah, thank you. In short, I would direct those interested to our interim update that is available on our website. I think we can post a link to that update. This was a topic that was considered as part of the land sector and removals guidance process that is still underway. The update provides some history on how that was approached, as well as the current status. But in short, that is a topic that will be largely moved forward into this future stakeholder process related to market-based accounting.
Wonderful. Thank you, Kevin. We have less than a minute left and a lot of questions remaining. I think this is indicative of a lot of interest and a lot of excitement to get into this process. We share that as well. But for Day, I think, Pankaj, if I could turn it back to you for any closing remarks. But I will say thank you on behalf of the entire GHG Protocol team for everybody's input. It's been a process to get this all summarized, and we're really looking forward to moving forward together with everybody. Pankaj, can you close us out?
Yeah, thank you, Michael. And I also thank you, everybody who joined the discussion today. And again, our apologies, we are not able to respond to each and every question specifically. But I do want to make a point that, as I said in the beginning, it's a journey that I think your participation is essential. Only with our collective engagement and contribution that I think we will be successful to achieve the right outcome. And I think your active participation is what we welcome very much. This is a phase between now that the webinars have been completed, summaries will be shared, some have been already shared. And between this phase now and the setup of technical working group, where a lot of informal discussions are taking place. It is like collection of all the right materials that we will then feed into the technical working group process. A lot of clarity and understanding is being created right now. And we would welcome if you would like to engage with us. Please reach out to the team, to me, to Michael, Kevin, and others to set up separate calls and discussions. And so this all ultimately contributes to a very successful formation of the future process in the first quarter of 2024. So with that, thanks again. Thank you again for joining this webinar and all the other previous webinars. And please stay tuned for our next steps coming soon your way, likely through the newsletter. So please also remember to subscribe to the newsletter. Thank you very much.